I veiled myself just to emphasize the revealing power of research. But before we even start our research projects and explaining them like taking off a mask, research is like taking off a mask, right? Some masks are more beautiful, some masks are delicate. But before we do that, I want to introduce the man with the vision. And I want to call on Professor Fabio Carrera.
You got to take the. Who was it? Oh, we know. All right. So, è partita? Okay. All right. So I'm going to do an introduction first about WPI. For those of you who don't know, you guys obviously all know. But I think there's a couple of new people here that haven't heard this. And then we're going to leave the floor to you guys for the awesome research you've done. So let's start from. Do as I say, not as I do. Let's see. Why is okay. Oh, it's backwards. Okay. Oh, that's the last slide. All right. Sorry, that was the last slide, which looks exactly this one. That's why it wasn't working. All right. So this is the list of presentations today. But before that, I'm going to introduce the whole space and Serendipity, which is the benefit company here to support the creation of jobs to repopulate the city. So that's our goal. A lot of this direction, but I think some of these projects will help some of the future startups to decide what to do to create jobs in this place, which is called the startup. Okay. Test, test. Okay, so one of the mics may not work all that great. What we call this place, for those of you who don't know, is called H3 Factory. It was the church for the adjoining Benedictine monasteries, nunnery, and this was the church for them. It's still a church-looking place, but if you came, so it was a church in the 1500s until the 1800s, but if you came even as recently as 20 years ago and you walked inside here, there would be a ceiling here. So you walk in and you have a ceiling because it was a factory. I don't know if you guys have seen this picture, but you can see the arches here. So these floors went all the way into the apses and the painted white. So you couldn't see the church anymore. And then about 20 years ago, the city acquired this and did this restoration that you see now by cutting the and bringing the church back out, which was completely obliterated. And the purpose for the restoration was to create a startup incubator specifically. So we received this from the city for 9 years. We have it till 2027. So you guys may be some of the few lucky students to have been in this place. We hope that they renew this place for us after 2027, but we have no guarantee. Serendipity stands for Serenissima Development and Preservation Through Technology. And for those of you who don't know us, the URL is at the bottom there. You can go see what we do. And what we do is three things, essentially. Starting from, we do culture with artistic activities, theater, fashion shows, being shot inside here for several months. And if you come on weekends, there'd be like some live performance of some sort. The second thing we do, a lot of time doing, last week is startups. So the main thing here is we run a program by MIT. The only MIT program in Europe is here in this space in Venice. Every year we select 10 startups and we have workshops in this space with faculty from Boston come in from Boston for the workshops from MIT. And so far we created 20 startups, and this year we're gonna recruit 10 more. But the most important thing we do is research, and that's what we're here for today. The main thing there is obviously the WPI Venice Project Center program that's been running since 1988. So for those of you who don't know, WPI is a polytechnic in Massachusetts. This is the picture of the campus. There's about 7,000 students at WPI, of which 5,000 are undergraduate. So we're primarily an undergraduate college. Over 70 degrees awarded to our students. These projects, research you're going to see today is a requirement, which is called the IQP, and it's a third-year degree requirement. So all these students are about 20 years old and of an engineering degree at WPI. Typically, we have 4 students per team, and the whole program takes 14 weeks, half of which is on campus here, and the other half in Venice doing the actual field work. And total of 2,000 hours per team are put into these efforts. So it's an effort that we keep doing since 1988. WPI does this in over 40 locations around the world, over 50 actually. These are all the project centers in the world, and the Venice Project Center was one of the first on this map, probably the second on this map. The first English center was in Venice in 1988. I'm not going to steal the thunder from the next team, but I just want to point out that if you go to veniceprojectcenter.org, you can see pretty much a lot of the stuff that we've done, not all, but a lot of what we've done since 1988 in 35 years. Over 250 cities, over 2,000 students, and this year, this is the biggest contingent of WPI students ever this year. 72 WPI students came. Israel team that came because they couldn't go to Israel in Term C. So we actually had over 100 WPI students this year here. So before everything's being recorded. It's going to be on YouTube, so your parents can look at it. I would like to thank the Serendipity team, Gianluca and Aurora, around the corner, and the interns that have been setting up everything for this. And without further ado, I will pass it on to the first.
We are Worcester Polytechnic Institute students. My name is Cameron. Our project was an exhibit to celebrate the achievements of the Venice Project Center. So the Venice Project Center, Fabio already stated a lot of this, but to reaffirm, it was established in 1988. More than 1,000 students have worked on the over 250 projects, and it is a long-term research program, which means that information from past projects can be pulled from future students for their information. So like I said, over 250 projects have been worked on here, which comes out to 485,000 hours of work. This is the first team that ever came to Venice. They're referred to as the bootstrap team because they determined the feasibility of a project center in Venice. They determined that, yes, we could in fact establish a project center at this location. So since then, projects have explored Venice from the top all the way to the bottom of the canals, in the sky, in the bell towers, and below the water. And all these projects are always using the latest technology available. So our task was to establish an exhibit. In order to do this, we need to know what kind of work has been done by the VPC. And so these are the primary 6 research topics that have been pursued throughout the students' time here. They consist of art and architecture, infrastructure and mobility, economy and society, nature and energy, history and geography, and science and technology. So we're going to start with art and architecture. So these are the main subtopics that make up art and architecture. Beginning with public art. So these are the different kinds of artifacts that have been cataloged throughout since the founding of the Venice Project Center. They have been cataloged in order to highlight the damages mainly that have occurred to them in order for restoration groups to actually prioritize different kinds of artifacts in order to restore them. So a way this was done was through Preserve Venice, which is a nonprofit that basically aids these artifacts and prioritizes restoration. So in total, this is 6,595 different kinds of artifacts that have been restored, have been cataloged by project groups. So for bell towers and bells, we have documented several of the bell towers in Venice. The map here includes is part of this documentation where it includes all of the bell towers that have been worked on so far. We have also restored and repurposed bell towers, and this has been done in several ways. For example, one of these was actually they installed antennas on the top of bell towers, or they made plans to do so. They've also considered converting them into greenhouses, and they've also made them as a means for fire prevention by spraying water out the top of them. And this is all done so that the city prioritizes these restoration efforts for the future. So more in detail, when you select a bell tower on the map, it brings you to a screen such as this, where it shows off a panoramic view, an audio of what the bell would sound like, ID numbers, names, locations, a lot of useful information. So we have also documented the missing artifacts, and that can consist of paintings, statues, and even buildings in some cases. So, and finally, we've documented churches and convents for the purpose of reusing them and repurposing them. And in fact, we are actually in one of these repurposed churches right now. So.
And the next major primary research area is infrastructure and mobility. There's 6 subtopics that make up infrastructure and mobility. And VPC was actually the first people to document the canals and canal segments, and they created an information infrastructure that is still used by the city until this day. The VPC has also documented all of the bridges in Venice, including the bridge heights, steps, surface area, and the pipes on the bridges. And this helps them determine how long it would take to maintain each of the bridges, and maintenance schedules were formed by the City of Venice using our documentations. The VPC also proposed a vacuum sewer system that the city almost adopted, and this project was so great that it won an IKP award from WPI. And the VPC has also mapped sewer damage at night during low tide because they were unable to view the canal walls and during the day. And here's some of the sewer outlets and sectional walls that the VPC documented. The VPC also documented all of the docks in Venice, and they created an application called Easy Dock, and it's basically an application that is used by the cities to make the docks more safe and useful. And all of the infrastructure was documented by all of the information was documented by the VPC and used by a company called Insula, and it was put into a book made by Insula called Venice, the City of Canals, and the info is used for maintenance by the City of Venice. The VPC also collected boat traffic data using certain points throughout the city, and they determined what boats make up the type of traffic, and the VPC taught this method to the City of Venice so they can collect their own boat traffic data. The VPC has also developed multiple proposals to reduce moto indoso in the City of Venice, and moto indoso is the damage to the shore created by waves from boats. And one of the proposals actually also won an award from WPI, and it was to reduce boat traffic by delivering by destination instead of product. The next major research area is economy and society. It's made up of 2 different subtopics. The VPC has documented all of the shops in Venice, and you can filter these shops by the year they're collected, the location, and the shop type. And the VPC also made an application to generate the continuous total amount of tourists in Venice, and you can filter these by day trippers or overnighter, and you can also see how these tourists arrived. The next primary research area is nature and energy. There's 3 subtopics in nature and energy. The VPC has created an application to measure the noise throughout Venice. And the VPC also has done thousands of measurements done by hand to measure the hydrodynamics. And they created an interactive application, show the direction of water in Venice and how fast the water moves in Venice. And we're not going to go too deep in the green spaces today because there's another group today about green spaces.
The next major research topic, this is on, right? Okay. The next major research topic done by the Venice Project Center is history and geography. One good example of this is the Venice Project Center created a digital framework for high quality and interactive maps using the Jacopo de Barbari view of Venice woodcut map as a basis for this. They also created an interactive timeline of the history of Venice dating back more than 1,000 years using the book Historical Atlas of Venice by Giovanni Di Stefano. The final major research topic done by the Venice Project Center is science and technology. They collaborated with National Geographic on their genographic project, taking DNA samples of native Venetians to determine the genetic ancestry of residents to this region and determine the first settlers in the region. And finally, we've also created a STEM lab for young Venetian students to generate interest in the science and technology fields. The Venice Project Center, in addition to all of these projects, we've gained a lot of recognition from international publications and have also received the President's Award from our host, Worcester Polytechnic, 5 separate times. In addition to being recognized by the university and by these publications, the Venice Project Center also aims to disseminate their information on their own. In the past, we have run a number of exhibit projects, usually on important anniversaries of the Venice Project Center's founding since 1988. For example, the 35th anniversary, 30th anniversary, going on and so forth from that. These projects have taken place in various spaces around the Project Center, around the building specifically and online. For example, there was one in the bell tower, setting up a timeline going up the stairs for that. And finally, it was determined that the most optimal space for an exhibit to be held in this building was the main stairwell.
All right, so in order to show you guys the layout of the stairwell and of our exhibit, we made a booklet for you guys. So it includes our diagrams, measurements, our plans for the posters, and a lot of other useful information. So this is one of the diagrams that are included. It's a diagram of the layout of the first stairwell, and this is also a diagram of the actual entire wall that the posters will be hung from.
Once we determined the layout of the exhibit, we decided that we wanted these introductory roll-ups at the base of the stairs. You can actually see examples of these right at the back of the room. This will allow us to introduce not only the Venice Project Center, but our exhibit for those who may not have gotten all of the background that you all just did. These will serve as a introduction to our exhibit. The other important thing that isn't our regular staircase layout is the elevator design. We wanted to make it a goal to make sure our exhibit was accessible to those with mobility disabilities. And due to the nature of our exhibit, we acknowledge that it is not possible for our staircases to be accessible to a wheelchair. So we decided to add a display into into the elevator. This will consist of two little roll-up or two smaller posters, probably similar to the introductory roll-ups, as well as an overview poster that will have links to the websites for all of the different topics. Speaking of those topics, it was a major task to narrow down over 20 topics that you saw at the beginning to 13 that we have decided to display, and it was a combination of efforts from the B23 Legacies group, our predecessor, and us determining which topics deserve to go into this exhibit. Once we determined the topics, we begun to lay out our posters. These are our first drafts of our informational posters. They were originally presented in a landscape orientation and primarily focused on the research and the actual information on the topics as opposed to what the VPC had done on those topics. However, we were able to use these posters to start determining hanging methods and the size that we wanted for our posters. This is our first ever draft of a poster. It was 150 by 90 centimeters, which is more than double what it needed to be. It was massive. But we were able to use this to determine that PVC plastic was the correct material for us. We then moved on to our second draft, where we tested and experimented with hanging methods and eventually determined a pole with wires attached would be the ideal hanging method. You can see our finalized version of that here in a digital format. We have decided on a metal rod with transparent nylon wire. The nylon wire is nice in this particular form because it'll has crimping abilities so that you don't have to have knots that don't necessarily look professional. The most important thing, though, is the content of the actual exhibit. Each of our posters is going to have a general overview of the topic. This allows people to have a background on something like moto andoso, which people might not be familiar with if they aren't from Venice. Then they'll have what the VPC did on this topic. This includes subcategories, technology used, numbers and data such as the amount of projects worked on, the first year of a project. Then we will have the impact. This is things such as awards or changes actually implemented by the City of Venice. And lastly, we will have posters and graphics. This allows us to visualize some of this data as well as make the poster more visually appealing, and also allows us to have a QR code which links to our website.
As Quinn was saying about our website, the website is going to have a page for each of our topics, and each page is going to be split into 4 general sections. And I'm going to give you a quick demo of the canals page. On the right-hand side, you can see it's a general overview. The general overview is here to fill up any missing holes in the poster because we were limited by physical space, and on websites, virtual space is basically unlimited. And on the left-hand side, you can see notable VPC projects. These are all projects related to canals. And as you scroll down the page, you can see a timeline of each of the projects along with a short description. And the story map that the V23B Legacy team created is also linked on this website. And every page is going to have additional content that's specific to each topic. And this map of the canals is ripped from VeniceProjectCenter.org, along with a lot of the other additional content on the other pages.
The final portion of our project that we created is a digital render of the exhibit in its final form. This is the view from the bottom of the staircase looking up. You can see the 2 roll-ups standing next to each other. Moving up the stairs, you can see all of the posters hanging from their metal rods. And this is an idealized view of the entire staircase from the back. There's actually a wall there, so you wouldn't be able to see this exact view. But this is the general layout of how we would recommend this exhibit to be laid out in the future. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Our project's team is an assessment, or our project is an assessment of Venice's dependence on tourism. I am Benjamin Smola.
I'm Ian Blanchett. And I'm Andrew Bissig.
So the historical city has fluctuated significantly throughout the years, major highlights you can make are a series of plagues throughout the historical city. However, the city has always recovered from these plagues, where you can see major rebounds after each plague. But after World War II, there has been no sign of rebounding. The population in the historic city in 1951 was 174,000 residents. But as you can see in recent years and today's population, the population is lower than 48,000, or lower than 49,000. And the question is, will this population rebound? Meanwhile, the tourism has been growing and monopolizing the economy. The main reason population is declining is due to a lack of economic diversity. And relating to economic diversity is a lack of job diversity in the city. Economic diversity can be shown through the demonstration of COVID and the fragility of the economy during COVID. A major highlight is in 2020, there was an 8% decrease in the GDP of the Veneto region. This shows that a more diverse economy is desirable for the historic city. What we're trying to figure out is if Venice itself and the economy is becoming more or less diverse over time. And diverse is relating more into economy, in which we used street-facing stores as a proxy for the economy.
So as Exhibit has already said, WPI has been collecting data on shops since 2004. And so the data that has been collected on these shops includes the location of these stores for latitude and longitude, which helps the shop's app, the application that shows all of the stores. It helps it show the map. It has the name of all the stores, the building number, the address, the siestere, the year the data was collected, the type and category. The type of store is what the store sells, and the category is a overarching category that includes multiple types within it. For example, restaurants and bars are one overall category, which includes restaurants and bars. Whether or not this location has changed, what kind of store it is from the year prior, and its tourist focus. We obtained our data set by combining the 2004 and 2022 data, in which we compared the two to find the overlapping addresses, in which we found about 2,700 addresses that overlapped. And the way that the touristicity classification works is there were 3 classifications of resident, mixed, and tourist. And they were based purely off of shop type in the past. For example, a resident goes to a hardware store. So all hardware stores were considered resident. And all souvenir shops, where only tourists will go, is considered tourist locations. But where it comes to mixed, restaurants, for example, can be either resident or tourist, or somewhere in the middle. So what we did is we added 2 more classifications of mostly resident and mostly tourist. And then we manually reclassified all 2,700 addresses. We manually reclassified 2,700 addresses for a total of 5,400 total entries reclassified. And this is how we reclassified them. We would look at a picture and what type of store it is. So we looked at this one, for example, is a hardware store where they sell stuff that only a resident would need. So this was a completely resident-focused location. And this store, when we looked at the picture, was a souvenir shop. It sells glass and masks, so it would be a 100% tourist business. After we took these classifications, we were able to put them in a map where we show all 5 points on here within the different colors. And from that, we were able to create more maps, which shows all the different classifications, including closed. Notably here, closed stores over the 18-year period has increased by 90 stores. Resident-focused stores have dropped by almost half. Mostly resident stores have also had a dramatic decrease. Mixed stores have gone up by roughly 10%. Mostly tourist stores have gone up. And tourist-focused stores have gone up by not as significant margin.
So using these maps, we were able to make a major comparison, and you can see the change in flow of each classification from 2004 to 2022. Major things to see is that the tourist level in 2004 related to 2022 has taken a major increase, as in 2004, resident-focused stores have taken a major decrease. These were things that we wanted to highlight, along with closed stores having a major increase as well. Looking more deep into the maps, we were able to see the change in flow of certain stores. So in 2004, there was 354 resident stores that changed, and in 2022, there was 135 closed stores, 125 tourist stores, and 94 mixed stores. We did this same focused for tourist stores to see their change over time from 2004 to 2022, where there was 222 tourist stores, going to 124 closed, 40 resident, and 58 mixed. And we saw the change in closed stores, where there was 119 closed stores that changed, in which there was 49 tourist stores, 35 resident, and 35 mixed. We use this to create a comparison of businesses, in which Andrew discussed earlier, the business by type. So we talked about the classifications for each of them, and we were able to highlight from 2004 to 2022 the major increases in businesses, where the green shows the business that increases over time versus the red that shows businesses that decrease. This is more relevant when talking about resident businesses and stores that focus on residents, where you can see the red signifying that this business has decreased over time versus only household goods has been a store that has increased. Oh, my bad.
And when we're talking about all of this, we can see over here the broad comparisons once again. We want to figure out how focused the city was on tourism in each of these years. We used these manually reclassified data points to determine that. As an example, if we look at all of the tourist-focused stores from 2004, of which there are 608, we can multiply that by the weight of 100% tourist focus, since these are all the tourist stores, divided out by the total number of stores in that year. And after doing that for all 5 of these classifications, we found that 2004 had about a 55% focus on tourism. You can see that 2022 had about a 62%. That means we saw about a 7% increase between the 2 years, which is a fairly significant margin given the relatively short amount of time between them. But there's more to this story. Looking at the number of businesses isn't enough. If we're going to do economic estimates, we need economic data. So what data did we decide to use? Well, we found the cost of doing business, which for our purposes means the cost of their expenses. It's how much money they'd need to make to stay open. In order to estimate this cost of doing business, which we'll be calling CODB for the rest of this, we need to take a few broad steps. Firstly, we have to organize all of our financial data. Our financial data came in one of 2 forms, either the rent and the wages seen over here in a table, or a given flat value, which is how much the business spent on their expenses, exactly what we're looking for. We got 86 financial data points from this table and 30 from billing sheets like this. The way we decided to organize all this data once we compiled it together was by the ATECO codes. These are the government-level classifications for businesses. Tells you what kind of business it is when you're doing billing sheets like that. As an example, this business here, 47, 24, 20. The 47 is the broad category, which in this case is just retail trade. The 24 is the subcategory, which in this case refers to retail trade of food products, and then more specifically of breads and confectionaries. And the 20 on the end is the exact store type, which in this case refers to confectionaries, aka a bakery. Our second step was to group all this data broadly so that we could work with it more easily and get better estimates. An example of how we would group that is using these stores. You can see we have 47, 78, 20, 32, and 99. The 20 is a photo and camera store. The 32 is for a craft store. And the 99 is just other non-food retail. For our purposes, these stores can all be considered miscellaneous retail, which is what 4778 means on its own. Our third step was to estimate this CODB per group of businesses, now that we have it. As an example, we'll see the glass stores that we had. We had financial data for 4 stores that were considered glass stores. Now, a blank box here refers to €0. They had no spending on that expense. A business that had no spending on wages had no employees. There was only one person working there, so their wage is just any profit that the business makes. A blank in rent means that they own their building. They don't pay a rent or mortgage to anyone. This is most common for artisans who've been in the same place for a very long time. The calculation for this, also fairly simple. It's either the wages plus the rent multiplied by their tax rate, which would be a universal 22%, or just the given value that we already have. Just as an example, for this top store, it would be the $12,000 from wages plus the $8,000 from rent multiplied by that 22% tax rate to get the CODB of about €26,000. Alternatively, for this last glass store, we have the value already. It's about $11,000. And our last step is to find the overall CODB for all of these stores that we have. The way we did this is by taking a look at all of the types we're considering, listing them all out next to each other, as well as the number of financial data points we have for each. Looking at the CODB for one store of each of those business types, in this case 31 and 14,000. Then from our manually reclassified data, we looked at the average tourist focus of that type of store. In this case, glass was about 81% tourist focus. Next up, very simply, multiply it by the number of stores we have of that type. And that can help you find the theoretical amount you'd need in euros from both tourists and from residents for that store. The value we got out the other side for 2022 for the amount of money that all of these stores would need to make from tourists in order to remain open is about 111 million euros per year. And this was across about 2,670 stores. Italy overall has a tourist dependence of about 11%. The economic income from tourists makes up about 11% of Italy's total economy. We found that Venice was about 62% dependent on tourism by this data, almost 6 times the dependence. All that means is that the tourist dependence of Venetian stores is at least 62%. And why do I say at least? I thought we had the exact number. Well, there's one major player that we didn't have direct financial data for, which is hotels. We had about 388 hotels in our data set. They are obviously 100% tourist focused, as I think we can all agree, but we had no data for them. So can we just not include them? No, we just have to make a broader estimate. In this case, we decided to use the same CODB per store as for a restaurant or a bar. And we did this because we're assuming that hotels are spending at least as much, if not more, than a restaurant would be on their expenses every year. And you can see as well, they have a much higher tourist focus, being 100% instead of not 100%. With these hotels estimates in there, we were able to calculate a new CODB of about 169 million euro per year, and a new tourist dependence of about 71%, which is significantly higher again. But what conclusions can we draw from all this data? This is a lot of numbers and not a lot of conclusions. Well, Venetian stores we now know are at least 71% dependent on tourism. Again, these are more of a floor estimate. If a hotel is spending more than a restaurant on average, this number will go up further. And we've noticed that due to the increase in tourist focus, Venice is getting more dependent on tourism over time, which means population is going to continue to decrease as tourism monopolizes the economy further and further, and job diversity goes down more. We do have some recommendations for future groups, since we weren't able to cover everything we wanted to in our fairly limited amount of time with this project. Firstly, reclassify more stores. Go through more stores manually using this 5-point scale and get more data. A broader data set is always good for making estimates like this, and with the amount of stores that WPI and the VPC have cataloged over the years, you could get a great estimate. And secondly, get more financial data. Now, our financial data covered about 3,059 out of the 5,200 stores in the overall data set in the Shops app, as we were discussing earlier. This is all the data that the VPC has collected about these stores. This is about 60%. Not bad, but we had to estimate for 388 hotels. We didn't have financial data for it at all. And we had to group things in order to be able to use more of our data. They were logical groupings, but you lose specificity by doing that. And lastly, we were only able to use 59 of those financial data points, which we had to extrapolate to over 3,000 stores, which is a pretty major extrapolation, and you lose a lot of accuracy. Reducing extrapolation and increasing accuracy should be one of the primary focuses of any future teams, be it through the VPC or otherwise, that are hoping to do a similar project to ours. Thank you very much. Any questions?
So, good afternoon, everyone. We are researchers from WPI, just like the previous groups that have come up on the stage, and we are studying the Venice entry fee and the perceptions of impacts of such a fee on tourism here in Venice. So, I'm Alex.
I'm Mark.
I'm Tim. And I'm Samir.
And let's get started. So, this clicker is great. So, this graph may look a little familiar from a previous group, but essentially, the main trend behind our research is that tourism has been growing in Venice, essentially nonstop since at least the early 2000s. The main dip here is COVID-19, because no one could travel during a global pandemic. So stays are this orange line, so they're a subset of tourists. You can see that they've been growing essentially nonstop since 2003, with the big break being COVID, because no one could travel during COVID. So obviously the blue line's residents, and a later group will deal with residency here. But essentially, zooming in on this point in 2022, you can see that during tourist season, which is spring here and autumn here, essentially on any given day, tourists outnumber residents. So essentially that means Venetians are clamoring to reduce tourists because on the streets, any given person is probably a tourist. So Venetians are fed up with foreigners. They'll graffiti their monuments, Rialto's always shoulder to shoulder. They don't like their tourists. So what policies has Venice implemented to curb tourism? Venetians are clamoring to reduce tourism, so Venice has to do something. So the first thing we studied was the overnight tax, then we studied a hotel moratorium, Airbnb restrictions, and finally the Venice entry fee, which is the focus of our project. So the overnight tax was implemented in 2011, and basically it's a fee added to the total lodging cost when you book an accommodation, say an Airbnb, a hotel, any place you stay in Venice, you have to pay a fee. This fee is $350 per person per night, up to 5 nights, and essentially, if you're staying in Venice, you gotta pay it, and there are no exceptions. Few exceptions. So, the next thing is a moratorium on hotels implemented in 2017. What is this moratorium? Basically, in the historical center, so not this island, like places around San Marco, you cannot convert buildings into hotels anymore. It's not allowed. The reason for that is because Venice is trying to combat buildings turning into, or essentially businesses turning into tourist accommodations. The previous group has shown that. So, essentially, the caveat here is that this island that we're on and other minor outlying islands are not included. So basically, tourism and the overnight stays will gradually go out over time to the outlying islands because newer hotels, if they continue to be built, are going to be on the outlying islands, not in the historical center. So if you regulate hotels, you have to regulate Airbnb restriction, or you have to regulate their main competitors, which are Airbnbs. So in 2019, the Greater Italy implemented basically legislation that enforced Airbnbs need to be registered and clearly display an ID. Here in Venice, this ID is known as the CIR, and it might even be displayed on your Airbnb itself outside on a plaque. Basically, this is just a disincentive to prevent landlords from getting into the game because they have to go through the whole process of registering their building. And a new restriction is that in Venice, the sewer system is quite old and is antiquated, which means that new Airbnbs are required to have septic tanks to mitigate the load that these buildings will have on the sewer system. Now, the reason why this is a key point is because doing this, installing septic tanks into buildings, tens of thousands of euros. This is a huge disincentive. So essentially, this is a moratorium on Airbnbs. That's how it acts. So finally, the crux of our research, the 2024 entry fee trial launch. 29 days, red circles here. Basically, you have to register to get into the city, except for Venetian natives like our lovely Fabio. Essentially, if you have to register if you're any of these groups, and if you're not any of these groups, overnighters, residents, students, workers, etc., you have to pay €5 to get into the city on weekends and holidays from 8:30 to 16. For the Americans in the crowd, that's 4 p.m. So why did Venice implement an entry fee like this? Hand it off to Mark.
Well, there are 3 main reasons for this, and I'm going to go through them really quick. First is deter excursionists, quantify tourists, and collect funds. And I'm going to go through that in a little bit more detail. Firstly, Venice wants to deter excursionists from weekends. Venice wants to stop overcrowding on peak weekends. And as you can see on our graph, the dark brown is the weekends, and the goal for Venice is to make this graph as flat as possible to spread out tourists throughout the whole entire week. On any given day, there are 60,000 to 90,000 day trippers, and that takes a huge toll on the Venice's economy and its infrastructure. And they also want to encourage visits longer than one day. If someone stays in a hotel or in an Airbnb, they're spending a lot more money in Venice, and it goes towards their economy and also possibly preserving the infrastructure. So the city of Venice wants to quantify who's coming in. They do that by gathering daily data on city users, as is shown on the Community di Venezia website, where every day the tax is in effect, they post numbers of how many people were in. And it also helps city officials understand and control the visitors, that's where Enjoy Respect Venezia comes into play. And they also can track the volume and flow of tourists, where we have a sample here that we took from the Community di Venezia website, where we're able to make a comparative analysis with our own data, and so can they. And lastly, they want to collect funds for tourist mitigation. So for right now, up to date, they've collected 1.7 million euros, and their goal is to recover the money spent rolling out the fee, which was close to 3 million euros. And that money is going to fund preservation for the historical infrastructure.
So what did we find during our project? Well, let's see. We approached around 200 people, and of those 200 people, we interviewed about 119 of them using a survey that we created. Here is an outline in general of our survey with different sections. The first section is the characterization section, where we basically tracked the location of our surveys and the age range of our interviewees. You can see here that most of our surveys were held in San Marcos Square, but we also did it in other locations such as the Rialto, Academia, and Campo Santo Stefano. And then in terms of the interviewees' ages, we had a wide range of people from 18 to 25, all the way up to 50 to 59, and 70 plus. In the next section of the survey, we have the classification section. Here we track day tripper versus overnighter types, and also the types of day trippers. You can see the breakdown between day trippers and overnighters. We had about 52 day trippers and 67 overnighters that we surveyed. Within day trippers, we had our own subcategories based off a 2012 Venice Visit survey. In those categories, we had proper day trippers, basically people who come from home, visit the historical city of Venice, and then go back home on the same day. Improper are basically people who come to Venice but stay in the region, not in the actual city of Venice itself. And then indirect are people who basically stop maybe on their holiday. Maybe they come from Rome into Venice for the day and then go to Milan after that. And then opportunistic day trippers are basically people who take the opportunity, basically if they're in the region for work or some other thing and they want to visit Venice. Next section is the overnighter section, where basically we tracked how many days did overnighters stay, and what kind of accommodation did they stay in, and how did they pay the overnight tax. Here you can see the amount of days overnighters stayed. It tended to be between 2 to 4 days mainly, mostly 3 days. And they mainly stayed in hotels, but a sizable amount did stay in Airbnbs. And in terms of being aware of the overnight tax, even though all of them were in accommodation, only 51, most of them did know about the overnight tax, but 11 of them did not know about the overnight tax. And then in terms of how they paid the overnight tax, you can see most of them paid in check-in, most likely due to paying their hotel fees or in their bookings. And you can see the breakdown is that included, like those hotel bookings were in those, but separate charges are for like Airbnbs if they had to be collected separately for the city. And then the next section is the day tripper section, where basically we track how did day trippers arrive in Venice, what attractions did they visit, and with whom did they travel with. Here you can see most people traveled by train and bus, but a sizable amount did travel in through boat.
And here you can see the attractions people visited. Most were in San Marcos Square, mainly because we did most of our surveys in San Marcos Square. But a decent amount did just walk around the city. Most of the attractions they saw were from wandering the city, enjoying the city, and just traveling. And then in terms of the group types, they were evenly distributed mostly through our survey. Most people were friends with their family, in like a tourist group, or with their partner. And then the next section is the entry fee section.
And so next we're going to be looking into some of the statistics from both day trippers and overnighters on specifically the entry fee. And so some of the questions that we asked were if they were aware of the entry fee, if they had paid the entry fee, is the information regarding the fee difficult to find, as well as their overall opinions and other questions. So to go into those now, over a quarter of the participants that we interviewed were unaware of the entry fee. As 32 out of 119 did not have any idea of what we were talking about. And to go into the split between overnighters and day trippers, overnighters were better informed than the day trippers themselves, even though it was a day tripper fee. So overnighters, only 1 out of every 5 overnighter was unaware. However, 1 out of every 3 day trippers was unaware of the day tripper entry fee. And that can be somewhat attributed to the overnighters learning about the entry fee through their accommodation and online while making their bookings. Additionally, even though only a quarter of our participants said that they didn't know about the fee, around half of our total participants said that the information regarding the fee was at least a little bit difficult to find. And we also wanted to take a note of where they initially found out about the fee, in which the majority was online, and there was a decent quantity that found out from us, as well as from somebody else, from news, or from the transportation. Again, splitting this into the overnighter and day tripper. Overnighters were much more likely to find out online, like I had been talking about previously, through their bookings or some other online method, while day trippers were more likely to find out in person. And we also wanted to find out whether or not €5 was a reasonable price for this entry fee, to which most people responded that it was reasonable. 79 out of our 119 participants said that the €5 entry fee was a reasonable price. There was some on either end, but most people said it was reasonable. And we also wanted to get their opinions on crowding. And so again, a bunch of people said that it was kind of neutral, to be expected. However, there was a little bit of our participants that said that the crowding had a slightly negative effect. And the final question that we asked all of our tourists was that if they were in favor of the entry fee. And to our surprise, most of our participants were in favor of an entry fee. And over half of our participants were in favor, and only 23 out of the 119 participants that we asked had a negative view on the entry fee. However, there is the important minority of the people who thought that it was a very bad idea. And so now we are going to look at the opinions of this day tripper from Milan who thought that the entry fee was a scam. The sound isn't working. Is it? I don't think it's me. It's. How do we got it?
I know it's a little bit of a scam, to be honest, in my opinion, because it's just $5 per person that enters the city. But not everyone is paying this tax. Just they honestly, the police just see if you're speaking English. If you're a tourist, they're just going to charge you. Yeah. And I don't think that's cool, to be honest, because if you charge some people, you gotta charge everyone or nobody, in my opinion.
And so to move on from there, we also want to differentiate the overnighters and day trippers' opinions on the entry fee. So what we found was that overnighters generally had stronger opinions than day trippers. So the overnighters had a similar layout that most of them were either indifferent or in favor of the fee. However, we had a lot more people that were very strongly against the entry fee or strongly for the entry fee. Looking at the numbers, 44% of the overnighters had a strong opinion, either positive or negative, while only 31% of day trippers had a strong opinion. And very importantly, of the day trippers that we interviewed, 25% of them had not paid the entry fee. 1 out of every 4 day trippers that was supposed to be paying the entry fee was not. And this is indicative of the communication for the day trippers not being quite where it needs to be. Because every single one of those day trippers that did not pay had no idea what the entry fee was. There was nobody that we found that was doing it out of malice. It was solely ignorance. And so to go through some of the conclusions from our survey, 96 out of 119 of our tourists were either neutral or in favor of an entry fee. And 79 participants thought that the €5 entry fee was a reasonable price. And finally, interviewees stressed that the revenue needed to go to the right cause. And additionally, they also shared the sentiment that €5 would not be a sufficient deterrent. And with that,
so the question we're trying to figure out here is, has the entry fee been successful? Well, let's go back to the first part of our presentation and look at our goals. We'll start with collecting funds for tourist mitigation. Well, we would argue that the fee is on target to pay for itself. Up to today, they made 1.7 million euros over only 21 days. And we project the entry fee will make 2.4 million by the end of the trial. Though they will not recover the 3 million euro that it took to roll out the fee, we believe with an extended period of time, this fee can be an absolute success. So has the entry fee been successful in collecting funds for tourist mitigation? Absolutely. Next, we're going to take a look at deterring excursionists from weekends. Out of 52 interviewees that arrived on a weekday, none of them came on a weekday to avoid the fee. And this has been a common occurrence throughout our surveys and through our video interviews, as this woman can tell you right here.
The reason they say that they did it, it's because they don't want a lot of people just coming for the day.
Yeah.
But €5, it's nothing. I
Yeah.
mean, if they charge €100, yes. But €5, I don't think it makes a difference. It may help the city, to preserve the city, but I don't think it's for just to keep people away. €5 is not enough.
All right, so will we say that the entry fee has been successful in deterring excursions from weekends? It has not. We have absolutely, perfectly zero proof of that. So lastly, we want to take a look at quantifying who comes to Venice. Venice has been publishing detailed data about tourists, as you saw in the beginning. Every single day that the tax is in effect on the Community of Venezia website, they post all their numbers of, for example, how many paying people they had, how many overnighters, and in total, how many people were exempt from this tax. And thanks to the registration enforced by the entry fee, we also know numbers such as how many day trippers came in, how many overnighters came in, and using this, the Venice Control Room is able to make accurate assumptions of tourist flow and able to track tourists throughout the city and make informed decisions through that. So the entry fee has been successful in quantifying who comes to Venice. Lastly, we have recommended moving the fee off of Sundays because Friday has a consistently higher turnout than Sundays, and Fridays and Saturdays have the highest count of tourists overall. And lastly, based on gathered registration data, we think that making the fee use dynamic pricing is a better way to deter tourists. If people see that on peak weekends the price is rising, they're much less likely to come. Thank you for listening, and if you want a more detailed analysis, you can check our website, and does anyone have any questions?
Good afternoon, everyone. Today we'll be talking to you about our safety-based estimation of Venice's carrying capacity. That is, the maximum number of people that can fit into the city. My name is Keegan Kuhn.
My name is Nicholas Olson.
My name is Nell Castelli.
And I'm Luke Sandeman.
To go back to what you just saw multiple times, here's a look at the trends of the population in Venice. Here's the residents, of which there's about 60,000 throughout the year. This is a pretty practical graph. You can see it drops on the weekends and major holidays when people leave, also during the summer. It's not perfect. A lot of it's extrapolated from Vodafone to the other providers, but it does a good job of showing the trends. But when we add in the tourists, there's a lot more than there are residents. On average, there's 60% more tourists than residents, and at its worst, there's almost 3 times as many. Now, this causes a lot of problems. There's crowding in the streets, it's hard to get around, and this really irritates the locals. A survey from our sponsor, Professor Bertocchi, of over 6,000 residents and former residents shows that the problem is very well recognized among the people, and a large amount of them think that's at its worst, super bad crowding. These pictures really show, they really speak for themselves, but they show that the tourists are not appreciated. They're a big problem. As the previous team just mentioned, there's been many attempts at deterrence, most notably the new day tripper tax, but people are just going to keep paying them, especially if it's only €5. They're going to keep coming, and there's no set limit to the number that can come, or numero chiuso, that is a closed number. So now I'll pass it on to Nick, who will talk about the background of our project, which is to find such a number and determine what the maximum number who can fit in the city is.
So while Venice doesn't have a numero chiuso in place, meaning they don't restrict the population right now, there have been studies that have suggested numbers, basically the number of tourists that can be allowed into the city each day. They began in 1988 and they sort of cap off at around 35,000 tourists per day. These were all done with different methods. And then in 2015, one of our very own WPI groups did a safety-based carrying capacity model, basically treating this region between San Marco and Rialto as a stadium. And the exits off of that stadium are the bridges off of that region. So we're using the same standard formula that the 2015 group used, which states that the maximum occupancy is equivalent to the flow rate times the amount of time the evacuation takes times the total egress width. And I'm going to go through each of these and explain what they are in the context of their project and our project. So to avoid panic, the evacuation should, in theory, take 8 minutes. This is part of the European standard, but 8 minutes is also the cap because stampeding might happen after that time. People are crowded together and they might start to trample over each other. I mean, it can turn into a very dangerous situation. Like, for example, back in 2015, in Saudi Arabia, there was a crush and over 2,400 people were killed. So people trample over each other. There's no clear cause, so people can just start freaking out for no reason. So it's not a good thing. So we want to avoid this. And another part of the standard is the flow rate, which is the 66 people per meter per minute. So we have the 8 minutes times the 66 people per meter per minute, getting us 528 people per minute. And then we're going to multiply by the egress widths of all of the bridges, which the egress width that we're picking for each of the bridges is the limiting width, just because, as you can see in this diagram, people are flowing through. This is essentially the limiting width right here. That restricts the flow overall. So thanks to the work done by a 2013 project group, we have a well-compiled list of each of the bridges and their minimum egress widths. So we have them for each of these bridges in the region that we discussed at the beginning, that the 2015 group used. And then we can apply the multiplication by 528, and we can get the capacity of each of these bridges for the 8-minute period. Then if we add that together and extrapolate to the whole city, we get their number of 34,000. So this is 34,000 tourists per day that can be permitted into Venice according to the 2015 model. And there it is. And so Professor Dario Bertocchi, our sponsor, did a tourism carrying capacity model in 2020. And so it wasn't a safety-based approach, but it was more of just looking at the infrastructure of Venice, seeing like, oh, we have this many restaurants that can serve this many meals. Can we sustain like all the tourists that are coming in with the amount of meals that we have? Can we manage the waste that's being generated by these additional tourists? Professor Bertocchi came up with his model, asking questions like that, and he came up with his number of around 52,000 tourists per day. And so we collaborated with Professor Bertocchi to come up with our model and our number, and I'm going to pass it off now to Nell, and yeah, we'll explain how.
So, our project expands off of the 2015 approach. Instead of trying to apply it to a small, densely populated part of the city, we applied it to the entire city. And we started off very small. We started with islands. And the way you do this is you multiply all of the bridge widths by our number for our egress, and we get, for each individual island, a unique number. And we're not doing this to determine the carrying capacity of the whole city. We are doing this to get a good look at what the city looks like right now. So at its minimum, the smallest islands can only hold about 1,200 people. On average, it's about 6,000. And some of the massive islands that connect to a lot of other islands have about 23,000 people as a maximum capacity. Now, what we get out of this is we can identify there are a couple of notable locations. First of all, this island right next to Piazza di Roma and this island right along one of the main roads of Venice are along two major routes that, in the case of short-term evacuations in smaller areas, may result in people getting crushed into a smaller space and panicking. There are other locations like this around here, and around here, that when we do our later calculations, we will find that these are actually some of the major bottlenecks that limit evacuation in this city. So then we take a step forward, we take a step out, and we try to get a general idea of what the number of people is like by doing this same technique on every single sestiere and adding them together. And you can see the breakdown of this here. We get about 152,000 people. Now, when we bring this a step further onto an island level, you're going to get a much lower number of 32,000 people. This is all people, not just residents, not just tourists. But in order to explain how this is the baseline for our final number, I am going to break down how this number works. There are three major exits out of Venice. First, the Santa Lucia station in Canareggio. Second, Piazza di Roma leads into Tronchetto, and you can get out by a second bridge there. And then third, there are various boat stops around Venice where you can leave by Vaporetto in the case of an emergency. So we're going to start at Ferrovia at the Santa Lucia train station. The limiting factor is not actually, getting off of this bridge. The limiting factor is getting from anywhere else in the city onto Ferrovia. And the reason is, once you are on Ferrovia, the rate of people coming in is less than the rate of people going out. So our limit is 1,600 people per minute based on the flow rate of all of these bridges. We do the same thing for Piazza di Roma. Again, the limiting factor is getting into Piazza di Roma from somewhere else, not getting from Piazza di Roma out of the city. So we get a number of 1,300 people per minute. With boats, it's a little more complicated. We specifically do not use the boat stops inside of the Grand Canal. The reason is, if all of these boats are operating at maximum capacity, at the same time, they're going to be conflicting with each other, and there is going to be congestion inside the Grand Canal. This is bad. So instead, we specifically identified 24 boat stops that are around the outsides in important locations and used those as our major exit points. And If all of these are operating at an optimal capacity, you can get 1,100 people per minute out of the boat stops. So if you add that all together, that is 4,000 people per minute can get out of this city at an absolute maximum, given like completely optimal conditions. And if you multiply that by 8 minutes, you get 32,000 people. Now I'm going to pass it to Luke to explain why this number doesn't quite work and how we expanded on it to get our final number.
All right, so obviously 8 minutes, can everybody hear me, is too short an evacuation time for an entire city. What we're really trying to do with the 8 minutes here is look at local spots and realize, how do we avoid crowding in any one spot for more than 8 minutes? And so if we look at a local bridge, at a very basic example, let's say you have a bridge where you have one person exiting the bridge per minute and more than one person entering the bridge per minute. Over time, a line is going to form, except in reality, it's not going to be a nice line where everybody waits their turn. It's going to be more like a mob. And so how much crowding is too much crowding? Well, if we use this basic example where we have one person out per minute times 8 minutes, that means in 8 minutes you could get 8 people across the bridge. So if you have that many people already waiting in line to cross the bridge, then the next person is necessarily going to have to wait that long. Except they're not going to be waiting very nicely. They are going to risk having a stampede. And so how many minutes until this happens is how long we can use that bridge with this additional buildup rate. And so if we know the exit capacities of all the bridges, which we get using the egress width that the 2013 group provided, and then the model that the 2015 group provided, and we know how long the bridges need to be operable for, we can figure out the maximum buildup rate before there is a very high risk of a stampede. And we do know that it can take up to 40 minutes to walk across from Santa Elena on this side of the city to the exits of the train station and Frovia. So, therefore, the bridges must operate for 40 minutes. So doing some quick algebra, we can basically come to the conclusion that bottlenecks can allow an entry rate of 20% higher than their exit rate for 40 minutes before there's a high risk of stampedes. And it's really important to note here that this is under ideal circumstances. This doesn't take into account people panicking, people having luggage, having wheelchairs, strollers, other baggage they might have that might get in the way of or clog a bridge, let alone if somebody decides halfway through the bridge that they want to turn around and find a different route, and then that's really going to cause a bottleneck. So this is absolute maximum. And so we take this principle and we apply it to bridges using the same rate as before, where we have egress width, 66 people per minute, 8 minutes, and this new crowding factor of 1.2. And we say, for example, with Ponte Academia, you can't have more people than 3,000 people within an 8-minute walking range of this bridge, all trying to use it at the same time, otherwise there'd be crowding. However, obviously there are more than one bridge in the city that would be used at once. So we apply this principle to the entire city using the city exits that Nell mentioned earlier, as well as internal bottlenecks that they alluded to earlier when they talked about specific islands in red. So here you can see the exits are in red, and internal bottlenecks, which I'll talk about more, are in yellow. But basically, applying that same model to the entire city for using the Ferrovia and Piazza La Roma exits, you can get from one chunk to another chunk in 8 minutes, and the number of people who can do that is limited by these bottlenecks. And you might be thinking, well, wouldn't this person just take a boat out? We do take that into account on the next slide. So 8 minutes later, you can see that about 27,000 people who were originally in these regions now are taking the train station and Piazza La Roma out of the city. And additionally, about 6,000 people have been evacuated at a linear rate using the boat stops. And every 8 minutes, this continues, and more people evacuate. Until we get to our final number, where about 104,000 people are able to evacuate through the train station and Piazza Roma, and 44,000 people are able to evacuate during the boat stops during this 40-minute period. Which gets us to our final number of 147 total capacity, which includes the residents. So to get a number for just the tourists, we have to subtract the residents and commuters, which, using the same telephone communication data we had originally, we get a median of 82 residents and commuters. If that 82 number seems high, it's because we also take into account students and seasonal workers who would get priority over tourists. And so once you subtract them, you get 65,000 tourists, day trippers and overnighters, maximum that the city could evacuate. And when you look at our results in comparison to others, it makes sense. They're within the same order of magnitude, and they're a little higher because they really represent the upper limit, the maximum people you could possibly have in the city. It might be lower for a plethora of reasons that we've alluded to earlier, but it definitely isn't any higher than this. And so as our final conclusion, as you could have guessed, Venice needs to reduce the number of tourists. Venice currently has about 100,000 daily tourists, overnighters and day trippers. So if they impose this cap of 65,000 that we're recommending, that would mean about 36,000 fewer tourists per day. And extrapolating annually, if you were to focus this implementation on day trippers, you could argue that this could decrease the annual number of tourists in Venice by 13 million. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matt Hardiman.
And I'm Ian Parrish.
And we analyzed the use of second homes in Venice. So in order to define a second home, we first have to start off with what is a primary home. A primary home is owner-occupied for more than 6 months out of the year. It is the official address of the owner and their family, and you can only have one primary home. So a second home, it is not typically owner-occupied. There are many different uses for these homes, and you can own multiple second homes. There is no limit, even though they're all called second homes. So why are we looking at second homes? Their long-term rentals in Venice are becoming scarce with a finite housing stock. It is contended among many long-term residents, seasonal workers, students, tourists. So in this study, we had 3 main research questions guiding us. The first one is how many second homes are there in Venice? The second is how much are second homes being used? And the third is who uses second homes? So right off the bat, we'll start with how many second homes are there in Venice. So to do this, we used water consumption data from Veritas. Veritas is a public company that manages Venice's water consumption and trash. So over here, you can actually see a real water meter. This is actually Serendipit's water meter. We got this with help from Marco yesterday. And then this is the data that we received that we will be going in depth about. So the first useful aspect of this data was the longitude and latitude of each water meter in Venice. And then there are multiple homes per water meter in Venice. So we had to use the nuclei domestic units column to differentiate and get a total amount of homes that we have data for in Venice. So here you can see a map of the total homes in Venice. This 37,000 number is calculated from the Tari tax, and then our actual number of homes that we have data for is 35,280 that we analyzed. So in this water data, there was over 10 different categories of CAT tarifa. The tariff category for each home, because we're looking at homes, we only looked at the residential contracts for homes. So uso domestico residente, which is a primary home, and uso domestico non-residente, which is a second home. So this is a map of all of the primary homes in Venice. You can see there's about 23,000 throughout Venice. And then there's about 10,000 second homes in Venice. So here's the breakdown of homes. And then the most important part, it's water consumption data. Here is the water consumption in cubic meters for each home. We used the amount of domestic units to get the total consumption per home. So with that, the first thing that we looked at is how many homes are empty in Venice. And to figure that out, we did not just use homes that had zero water consumption. We took into account for leaks and homes that could be just under construction and using a little bit of water, or there could be an inheritance debate in court or something like that, so they're just left empty. So we used 0.1 cubic meters per month. So this is a map of all of the empty homes in Venice. As you can see, there's 3,000 empty homes. And then there are about 1,400 empty primary homes in Venice. As you can see right here, this little blue sliver. And then there is about 1,600 empty second homes in Venice. You can see that a lot of empty homes are in San Marco, which is a little surprising based off of its tourism appeal. And then there's not a lot of empty second homes in Giudecca, as Giudecca is one of the more residential areas of Venice. So here's a breakdown of all of the empty homes you can see right here. So now for the rest of this presentation in the study, we took out empty homes out of all of the rest of our data so that we could get an accurate analysis of homes that are being used. So our total number of homes that we looked at from now on is 32,000. So are there primary homes that are used for less than 6 months? In order to look at that, we used the telco data that the Max team just went over. We found out that the average resident occupies their home for about 89% of the year, and in that 89% of the year, they consume 2.56 cubic meters of water per month. So from that, we were able to get the 12-month occupancy consumption, which would be around 2.9 cubic meters, and then for 6 months to find out how many resident homes are not being used. For 6 months, we got 1.46 as the threshold that one home needs to consume to be occupied for 6 months. So again, the empty homes right here. And then we found that there are 1,961 primary homes that are being used less than 6 months out of the year. And there are 2,500 second homes. And then, you would expect to see this, that there is a large majority, most primary homes are being used over 6 months out of the year. So here is the pie chart of the breakdown. We took out the 1,961 from the primary homes, and we moved that to the second homes. So for the rest of the project, we accounted for these 1,961 homes to be classified under second homes because they could not be used. They could not be classified as primary homes as they're not being used for more than 6 months out of the year. So this is the new breakdown of homes. There's about 11,000 second homes and 21,500 primary homes. And with that, I'll pass it off to Ian.
All right, so our next big question was, of these second homes, how much are they being used? To do this, we used a similar method that we used in our first question, where we looked at the average resident consumption to determine a level of consumption equal to 6 months and equal to a full year. So we broke them down into 2-month periods. As you can see over here, we have our empty homes, which were excluded from our calculations. But using our average resident consumptions, we were able to categorize the second homes and the primary homes in terms of how long they are occupied based on their level of water consumption. It's important to note that we are working with water data that uses a monthly average, so these are not set in stone finite numbers. We have a very rough data set that we're trying to make conclusions from here. As you can see, we've blocked off these sections, every section that is under 6 months for the resident homes. As Matt just explained, if a primary home is not occupied for more than 6 months out of the year, it's legally not a primary home. So as you can see the breakdown, we have, wrong button. We have about 1,600 secondary homes that were only occupied for up to 2 months, 1,500 for 2 to 4 months, 1,300 for 4 to 6 months, about 600 for 6 to 8 months, around 500 for 8 to 10 months, and even less than that, around 460 for 10 to 12 months. It's important to note here as well, we have, clicked the wrong button again, sorry. We have these numbers, which represent homes that are consuming on average more than, they consume above the average a resident would consume for a full year. We're calling these homes fully occupied because, again, we're working with averages. It makes sense that we would have a lot of primary homes that are above our average number. We could take into account, you know, people with larger families, pets, if people have gardens, that sort of thing. So we can see the breakdown of our second home usage, the main thing we're really interested here. And we can see that a large majority of these second homes fall into our fully occupied section. But it's important to note that a good chunk of them as well, these 3 slices here, all fall beneath 6 months of usage. We also wanted to look at Airbnbs, as tourism, as I'm sure you can tell, is a big topic for us and a big topic for everyone working here. We used inside Airbnb data and GeoPortal data, which is the Italian government, as the tax team mentioned, legally Airbnbs need to be registered with the government. So we have the addresses and information about these Airbnbs. We were able to map them on top of our second homes. We found that about 5,000 of our second homes are being used as Airbnbs. That's a lot of second homes. With around 11,000 second homes, and this being a pretty fixed housing stock, having close to half of them be Airbnbs is a pretty significant number. So with that, we moved on to who uses these second homes. How can this water data tell us information about who's actually occupying that place? We want to step back for a second and acknowledge the 2 primary uses we found for owners of second homes. First was personal use. These are our vacation homes. An owner obtains this home so that they and their family and friends can use it when they like. Our second, which we're going to put a little more emphasis on, is the rental use. These are homes that are obtained by an owner to be rented to someone else. As you can see, there's a lot of overlap here. Many vacation homes are rented when they're not being used, and vice versa. Rental homes are used as vacation homes when no tenant is occupying it. So we're going to return to this breakdown again. And here we've vaguely categorized where we think each of or what kind of people we think are going to be falling in each of these usage categories. At the top here in these second homes, we can safely assume that these are personal vacation homes given how little they are used throughout the year based on their water consumption data. Around the 4 to 6 month area, we start to see possible tourist rentals and seasonal workers renting these homes. As we increase in the occupancy, we can say less and less about the type of people using that home because of our data. Again, it is a monthly average. A home that is lived in by a resident who is renting, long-term rental, could read the same average water consumption as a home that is frequented by tourists, a popular Airbnb, for example. So it's possible in this 10 to 8 month range that we have tourists and residents. It's possible that, again, because of our data, this is a place that's rented sometimes to seasonal workers and other times to tourists or possibly students. But again, we want to look at these here. In the second home category, our fully occupied homes, we can say with some certainty, are with some certainty are either used by a resident who is renting there long-term or by tourists. When we look down at the primary homes for comparison, we can see that many, many more are fully occupied. This is what we would expect to see. We would hope people living in primary homes live there and consume water. But the number of homes between these two is an interesting thing to look at. We have a much more even breakdown across the year with our second homes than we do with our primary homes. So I just spat a lot of numbers at you. What do we actually find? What's useful? So for our first question, we just wanted a set number. How many second homes are in Venice? We found that there are about 11,000 second homes in Venice. This includes about 2,000 homes that were originally designated as primary homes, but we found did not have the water usage to support occupancy for more than 6 months. With more second homes than originally suggested by our data, we can see that the official numbers may not be totally accurate to the actual truth of our second home housing stock. When we look at how much second homes are being used, more than half of our second homes are occupied for less than 6 months out of the year. So this tells us that in terms of long-term residents who are looking to rent, who don't own their own homes, they're not in these 6,000 homes that are using less than 6 months. Again, almost half of the second homes we saw were being used as Airbnbs. This paints kind of a bleak picture for anyone who's not a tourist looking to utilize Venice's housing stock, particularly the second homes. Which brings us to our third question, who's using them? We can say that that 6,000 number that's below 6 months occupancy could be used for short-term rentals if it's being used for rentals at all. Otherwise, it's probably being used as a vacation home. Either way, if you're a seasonal worker, a student, or a resident who doesn't own a home, you're not living in these homes. We have about 5,000 second homes that are available for what we're calling medium and long-term rentals. These are our students, seasonal workers, and residents. This is a really small number for a lot of people who need housing. Housing is not the cheapest thing in Venice, and with a fixed stock, building more is not really an option. So we found that there is a staggering number of second homes that are being utilized either for tourists or vacation home purposes that is impacting the amount of homes available to workers, students, and long-term renters. We want to acknowledge some of the people who helped us on our work here. Of course, our wonderful advisors, our sponsors. We want to acknowledge Veritas for providing us with the water data that formed the basis of most of our analysis. And for all the tech help, thank you, Ali. That's all we got for right now. If you have any questions, let us know.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. For our final presentation today, we will be showing you our project, Venetian Greenscape Reimagined, assessing parks, gardens, and other green spaces in San Polo and Santa Croce. And we'd like to open with this quote from John Ruskin, the author of Stones of Venice, who says, "The measure of a city's greatness is to be found in the quality of its public spaces, its parkland and squares."
We would like to begin with a little bit of history of private green spaces. Green spaces have existed all throughout human history, but typically these green spaces were private, dating back thousands of years ago to the Egyptian gardens, moving forward to the gardens of Sigiriya in Sri Lanka, or even more modern in the 1800s with the Garden of Versailles in Paris. What all of these green spaces have in common is their limited access. These spaces are only available for the rich and privileged few who own them or have access to them. Generally, they were a symbol of prestige and wealth. Public green spaces, however, are a much more recent concept. With the shift from a farming society to an industrial civilization, the need for all people to have access to some kind of green space became more apparent. Green spaces offer many benefits to the people. They offer an escape from the denseness and the pollution that is found within urban spaces. Additionally, people can recreate and socialize within these spaces. For an example of an early green space, we can head to the hometown of our university in Worcester, Massachusetts, where Elm Park was opened in 1854, making it the second oldest park in the United States and one of the oldest parks in the world. Venice's first public park, however, was built 44 years earlier. When Napoleon conquered Venice in the late 1700s, shortly after, he decided that he wanted to create a public park for Venetian residents to use. He chose a location in southern Castello, and with this location, he recklessly ordered the demolishing of a working-class neighborhood to construct the thoughtfully named Giardini Napolinici, which was built in 1810. The space currently occupies as part of southern Castello, which some of it having been reclaimed land compared to the previous, compared to the previous version of the map. And this location is currently used to host the Biennale art exhibition. The difficulty that Napoleon faced, and the problem that we face now, is that there's minimal space to open new green spaces. Every brown dot on this map is a building. And as you can see, there's a very low amount of space in between these buildings. So we could, for example, follow Napoleon's footsteps and bulldoze San Marcos Square to construct a new green space, but obviously this is a completely ridiculous recommendation. What we could do instead is take a look at private green spaces. All across Venice, in between buildings, canals, and walkways, there are private green spaces. You can see the greenery peeking over walls all across the city. Many of these private green spaces have been opened in the past. For example, Giardini Papadopoli, which was opened in 1920, and Parco Villa Grogia, which was opened in 1975. Other examples include Parco Sabrognon and Giardini Reali. Another example of some private spaces that are opened is some palaces have little gardens that are opened temporarily during the Biennale. So these green spaces, whether they're private or public, need maintenance. And this maintenance depends on how it's owned. For private green spaces, the owners of said green space fund the maintenance. They hire gardeners. For example, local gardener Michele Savorgnano, who is with us today, who works typically a few hours per each space during the week to maintain these spaces. Public green spaces, however, are maintained and funded by the city. The city creates contracts, and these contracts are picked up by co-ops. The co-op who is willing to do the maintenance work for the lowest amount of money will get the contract. For example, we met with Gabriele Zornetta, who is the head of the maintenance co-op Il Gruppo, and his co-op handles many of the public spaces in Venice. But if we are attempting to convert some of these spaces from private to public, the city would have to adopt the maintenance of these spaces.
And that brings us to our two main research questions. Is there enough green space in Venice? And if not, which private spaces can be opened up to be made public? So WPI has actually been studying green spaces all the way since 2017, and this being the fourth iteration of this project, with previous groups surveying the Sistere of Giudecca, Castello, and Cannaregio. So the question is, in these previous three areas, was there enough green space? The World Health Organization recommends a 9 meter squared area of green space per resident. And you can see Giudecca exceeds this recommendation with an area of 14 meters squared per resident. Castello just meets the recommendation at exactly 9 meters squared, and Cannaregio falls very short of this recommendation of only 2 meters squared per resident. So onto what we did. We surveyed the two Sisteri of San Polo and Santa Croce. And in total, we have found 221 green spaces. And if you want to look at this map, in the center area is where there's a numerous amount of green spaces concentrated, which is because it's right near both the bus stop and train station. And this eastern side of San Polo, right near Rialto, there is a notable lack of greenery. Speaking of San Polo, it has a total area of around 300,000 square meters, housing a total of 9,000 residents. We have found a total of 76 green spaces in this area, totaling an area of around 25,000 square meters. Santa Croce, on the other hand, is much larger with a total area of 1.4 million square meters, which is due to the 2 industrial areas that were added. It has a much smaller resident count of only around 2,000 residents. We found around 145 green spaces, totaling an area of 93,000 square meters. So, for these green spaces, what data did we collect on them? First, we collected location data, where the green space is, its address, its total area. Next, we calculated its vegetation coverage, vegetation quality, flowers coverage. Next, we counted the number of certain amenities that would help visitors, such as benches, trash cans, and light posts. Next, we covered whether the park and green space was publicly accessible, as well as whether it had access for wheelchair and stroller users. Finally, we noted any maintenance needs we found, such as litter or any broken amenities.
Oops. So getting into the actual results we found from our surveying, we will show you our data broken down through 3 different categories, the first of which is type. And for type, we have defined green spaces into 5 categories, starting with gardens, which are places of vegetation for specifically aesthetic purposes and leisure, which differs from a park, which usually has wide grassy areas, making it more suitable for physical activity and recreation. Next is the designation of street space, which is vegetation situated along a street or walkway, often rows of bushes or trees. Urban wild is a mostly unmaintained, more densely vegetated area. And lastly, farmland is obviously for the growth of crops. So looking at each type, we found 142 gardens, 67 parks, which if you're looking at, you might be wondering why there are so many parks. However, this designation does not take into account whether the spaces are private or public. It's just purely from looking at it, which of our definitions it fits into best. Continuing with 7 street spaces, 5 urban wilds, and 0 areas of farmland. Here are all of those categories put together. And when we look at a breakdown of the total areas compared with each other, we can see that parks occupy almost half of the total area, even though they have a much smaller quantity than gardens. This is because they tend to be larger. Gardens is obviously the next largest area, with street spaces and urban wilds combining together to occupy about a quarter total. The next designation we're looking at is public accessibility. Public spaces are open to all tourists and residents for most hours of the day, whereas hybrid is our designation for spaces that are open for certain individuals who are part of a group or maybe have a ticket. So this includes spaces like schools, churches, and some museums as well. Lastly, private spaces are not open to the public in any way, often just someone's backyard. So we identified only 10 public spaces in our area. Notably, Giardini Papadopoli is a recognizable one. Additionally, 10 hybrid spaces and a whopping 201 private spaces. And here's that map combined together. And again, if we look at the areas of each of those designations, we can see that private spaces occupy the vast majority of green spaces. The final breakdown we will be showing you today is condition. So we created a rubric with the help of data from past groups as well as our sponsor, Mr. Samagnano, in order to, in the least unbiased way, create in the least unbiased way, find a system for determining the condition rating for each green space. And this is broken into the categories that Jason described earlier. So beginning with unknowns, as I mentioned, many of the spaces were private. There were instances where we could see through a door well enough to collect the data we needed. We also utilized a 360 camera on an extending stick in cases where we really wanted data on a certain green space. However, we still have 165 spaces where we did not collect enough data to give it a condition rating. So moving on, we found no spaces that were completely poor condition, but 6 in fair condition, 17 good, 3 great, and no spaces that we thought were outstanding condition. Here are those combined together. And when we remove the unknowns, we can see that most of the condition ratings fell right in the middle of our scale in the good standing. So with all of the data we collected, we wanted to provide the city with some recommendations to improve the condition of existing public spaces. And so we did that both in a general scale as well as for each public green space specifically. So starting with, on a general scale, we recommend that spaces add missing amenities that we think are important, such as park benches, as well as, in general, increasing the quantity of native plant species, such as jasmine and oleander, which can be seen here. For parks and street spaces specifically, we recommend that the city partner with local artists more often to install art into more of the spaces, such as this crab sculpture at Museo de Historia Naturale. And additionally, spaces that are fit to do so should host more community events, such as live music, in order to bring more people to the space. On an individual green space level, we did a similar process. So we will show you one example of this with a street space on Rio Terra de Pensieri. You can see here our original condition rating sets us at good, with particular weaknesses in amenities and vegetation. And so with our recommendations in those 2 areas, you can see that it is possible to bring this green space up to a rating of great. And so we did this process for each of the public spaces.
Continuing on with the recommendations of the World Health Organization in the area per resident, we analyzed that there was 10.3 square meters per resident in the area of Santa Croce, while there was a area of 0.1 square meter per resident in San Po. That is likely due to the much higher resident count with the much lower total area. When we include the addition of hybrid spaces to look at whether or not there's enough green space in general for the residents, there comes out to be a total of 0.16 square meters, and with total green space, which is including all the private ones in addition to the public and hybrid, there is a 2.8 square meters per resident, which is still a far cry from the recommended 9 by the World Health Organization. All that means is that there needs to be a more incentive to make better use of what is currently there. So there was another metric we looked at, which is the proximity where people lived around green spaces. So using a metric of which publicly available green spaces had a good or better condition, and taking a 3-minute walk around those areas, we analyzed which areas were served by the green spaces that exist. As you can see, there are large areas here where there are not any publicly available green spaces for the residents. To combat that, we have chosen candidates that exist within these areas that lack coverage and suggested some of them could be used to be opened and provide for the residents there. For our to be used for these recommendations, we chose that some of them, they would be of good or better condition and have street access, which means like a door on the street, so that they could actually be opened. We chose 5 candidates within the areas of Santa Croce and San Polo to make do. Most of these are currently private, with San Polo 2360 currently being owned by the high school, which can be opened on out of school hours and on weekends to make use for the residents there. Here is a updated map of the 3-minute walk, now including the data, the candidates we suggested. There's still some gaps around, but those areas did not have green spaces that met the criteria of being candidates. Now we can look at the improvement in area for the area per resident. We can see that in Santa Croce there is an increase to 10.7, and in San Polo there's an increase to 0.3. While it still isn't a lot, it does triple the currently available public green space in that area. Additionally, now that with the candidates to be opened, they would need to be maintained. For this, we talked to get an estimate on how much it would cost to maintain these. We talked to Mr. Zanetto, who gave us costs per about how much annual cost for vegetation there is. So there is around a 250 to 300 euro cost per tree, 10 euros per linear meter of bush, and 2 euros per square meter of grass. With 42 trees, 53 meters of bush, and around 950 square meters of grass, to calculate to a rough estimate of 14,000 euros per year, which is a far cry from the 5 to 6 million Venice already spends on maintaining green spaces already.
So in terms of communicating all of our results from the study, we created a few different platforms, the first of which is this virtual catalog that is available at this QR code. So this catalog includes profiles for all of the public green spaces we identified, as well as our condition ratings and recommendations. Here is a sample page showing Giardini Papadopoli, and you can see that it includes a description, location information, a list of amenities, as well as vegetation. And here you can see some additional photos as well as our rating system. The second platform we created, which is available here as of this morning, is an online database that includes interactive maps. So, and this also combines our data with the data of the past 3 iterations of this project. So for example, this map allows you to swipe between the map of structures in Venice to reveal green spaces. So you can, and then the last feature of this database is called Find Your Nearest Park. So it shows all of the public green spaces across Venice and allows users to turn on their location data, from which they can click on individual parks and explore information about them. So that is our project. And to conclude, we believe that Venice's cultural significance should not be limited to its past. And we hope that our recommendations for the city will help to improve Venice's public spaces and promote its greatness for years to come. Thank you very much.